Thank you for the introduction, and thank you too for letting us speak tonight. My aim in the first part of today's program is simply to provide context for the second part, in which Daniel will describe in detail some of the Feriköy Protestant Cemetery's oldest heritage, specifically the gravestones in the cemetery's so-called Monument Row. To preface his discussion, I'll give you some general information about the cemetery. I'll orient you to its location, describe the layout and management structure, present some key statistics and features, and point out a few important burials. Secondly, I'll summarize the cemetery's founding and describe some of its oldest tombs. Were brought to Feriköy from a previous older burial ground. To understand the significance of today's cemetery as a cultural heritage space, it's essential to know how it came into being and what preceded it. Thirdly, to conclude, I'll mention some of the efforts of the Feriköy Protestant Cemetery Initiative, an academic group that is devoted to maintaining the cemetery in all of its aspects as an active burial ground, a heritage site, and a sanctuary of nature. The initiative was formed in 2018 by individuals associated with several Turkey-based foreign research centers, including the American Research Center in Turkey, with which I'm affiliated, and the British Institute at Ankara, where Daniel was working until a few months ago. Tonight's lecture stems from the initiative's efforts to promote the cemetery and to publicize its unique place in Istanbul's cultural legacy. To begin, the cemetery is located in the neighborhood of Feriköy in the larger district of Shifli on the European side of Istanbul. It's to the north of the Golden Horn, which separates this area from the city's historic peninsula, where such famous monuments as Topkapi Palace and Hagia Sophia are located. Shifli, along with the older districts of Pera and Galata, is historically a more westernized, cosmopolitan part of Istanbul, where the city's Christian, Levantine, and foreign communities mostly resided. Feriköy is also the location of Istanbul's main Roman Catholic cemetery, which is directly adjacent to the Protestant cemetery. This area is also close to Taksim Square, one of Istanbul's major hubs. In former times, the area around Taksim was occupied by a vast necropolis composed of several cemeteries, including the earlier burial ground where the oldest tombstones in Feriköy Protestant Cemetery were originally located. This now vanished cemetery was known as the Graveyard of the Franks, or plainly, the Graveyard of the Europeans. Prior to the opening of the Feriköy Protestant Cemetery in 1859, the Graveyard of the Franks at Taksim had served as Istanbul's principal burial place for both Protestants and Catholics for about 300 years. In terms of space, today's Protestant cemetery occupies 1.41 hectares, or just under 3.5 acres. The land was gifted by the Ottoman Sultan to the foreign legations of several Protestant nations in 1857 as a replacement cemetery for the Graveyard of the Franks, which had been closed by the Ottoman authorities a few years earlier. For the last 164 years, the Feriköy Protestant Cemetery has continued to operate under diplomatic supervision. The current administration is made up of consular officials of 7 nations who exchange management duties on a yearly rotating basis. There are close to 5,000 registered burials in the cemetery, and about 1,200 graves are marked with monuments. The site is divided into national sections for each of the managing countries, and data from funerary records shows that British and German burials combined comprise 64% of all recorded burials, with the British leading the Germans by 4%. From mapping and recording work, it is estimated that about 40% of the cemetery's ground, including space that can be reused, is available for new burials. Given the current yearly average of half a dozen to a dozen interments, it's projected that with newly introduced stricter qualifications for plot sales, the cemetery can continue as an active burial ground for at least another century. Although most of those buried in Feriköy identified in life as Protestants, others of different faiths and backgrounds, including agnostics and atheists, and even a few Catholics, also rest there. More than religious persuasion, foreign citizenship has always been chief criteria for acceptance into the cemetery. Indeed, a more accurate title for the site might be the Feriköy International Cemetery. Besides its tombs, the cemetery's main features are its chapel, an internal burial ground for Armenian Protestants, and its natural setting. Even though the chapel is the cemetery's most prominent building, no precise record of when it was constructed has been found yet. It is clear from accounting records beginning in 1868 that it was built sometime before that date, that is, between 1859 and 1868. Which is the same time frame in which Istanbul's Crimean Memorial Church was constructed, which you see on the right of your screen. The chapel's English neo-Gothic style and distinctive stonework resemble the design and masonry of the church, which makes one wonder whether the architect of Crimean Memorial, George Edmund Street, or maybe more likely the craftsmen who worked under him, might have had a role in designing and building the chapel. The building's appearance, along with the high frequency of British burials, is probably the reason why the cemetery was often referred to in the past as the English Cemetery Feriköy, as written on this circa 1900 postcard. A short distance from the chapel in the cemetery's southwest corner and walled off from the rest of the site is a separate burial ground for local Armenian Protestants. Soon after the Ottoman land grant for the cemetery in 1857, the representatives of the Protestant nations discussed giving portion to Protestant Armenians. Even though this community had been recognized by the Ottoman government as an official religious group in 1850, it still lacked its own burial places in Istanbul. The site was needed. After the Protestants split from the main Armenian Apostolic Church, they were excommunicated by the Patriarch, persecuted by most Armenians. This oppression didn't stop after death. The remains of Protestants buried in apostolic graveyards were often dug up and thrown in the street. The situation was resolved post-1860 when the Armenian space at Feriköy was created. Mostly Armenians are buried here, but the section also contains graves of Greek and Assyrian Protestants, making its Armenian designation a little misleading. Essentially, the space is reserved for locals, whereas the area outside its walls is meant for foreign nationals. Besides its function as a burial ground, the Feriköy Protestant Cemetery is also a sanctuary of nature. Its rich foliage and many trees, some which have monumental status, are not neatly designed but retain an untouched natural quality. The site also has abundant animal life. Various types of reptiles inhabit it, and local and migratory birds frequent it. Early last century, a Swiss ornithologist published sightings of birds in Feriköy, and in 2019, a bird watcher who was volunteering on the site for the initiative recorded a number of different types of birds over the space of a few weeks. These ecological attributes are especially important today as they make the cemetery one of the few green spots still left in the Feriköy neighborhood. Of course, the cemetery is first and foremost a burial ground, and people from all walks of life and nationalities rest there, including many who left their mark on Istanbul's history. I'll only mention three as an example. whose contributions in life probably did more than those of any other individuals to introduce Istanbul's history and monuments to the wider international public. The first is the Swiss scholar Ernest Montbury. Montbury spent most of his career teaching French at Istanbul's prestigious Galatasaray High School, but he also devoted himself to studying local history, art, and architecture. And in 1933, he published in French the first modern comprehensive guidebook to the city. It was later translated into several languages, went through several editions, and remained Istanbul's leading guide for the next 40 years, until 1972, when it was replaced by Strolling Through Istanbul, often referred to as Bible of Guidebooks to the City. More detailed than Montbury's work, it was written by two American professors at Istanbul's Bosphorus University, John Freely and Hilary Sumner Boyd, both of whom also rest in Feriköy. John Freely was an internationally acclaimed writer, and besides strolling, he authored more than 40 works on history and travel before he passed away in 2017. With such a long, rich history, Istanbul has many world-renowned sites and monuments, and among them, it's easy to miss the Feriköy Protestant Cemetery. In a different place, it wouldn't be overlooked. Despite its modest size, the cemetery is a major landmark with honorary heritage that attests to the central role that Europeans and other Westerners played in the life of Istanbul and the larger region for centuries. About 15% of the cemetery's tombs predate its opening in 1859. As I mentioned before, these monuments were brought to Feriköy from the graveyard of the Franks near Taksim Square. The graveyard had served Istanbul's Catholic communities for roughly 3 centuries. Tombs brought from there essentially give today's Protestant cemetery an historical legacy of more than 400 years. The graveyard of the Franks came into being around 1560, a very particularly lethal episode of the bubonic plague. The usual burial places around the district of Galata, seen here, at that time was the main urban area on the near side of the Golden Horn, were overwhelmed. It was then open countryside to the northeast in this direction, near present-day Taksim, were used to bury the many thousands of dead. Subsequently, this area became a major necropolis, which not only served Galata, but also the neighboring district of Pera from the 17th century onward. This vast burial place was known to the Turks as the Büyük Mezarlık, or the Big Cemetery, and to the Europeans as the Grand Champ de Mort, or the Great Fields of the Dead. It included separate cemeteries for most of the city's communities, including Armenian and Greek. The Frankish cemetery, of course, was reserved for European Protestants and Catholics. And in this map from the period, we see the district of Galata and neighboring Pera, and surrounding Pera are the various cemeteries of the Great Fields of the Dead, the Muslim Turkish cemetery, Greek, Armenian, and of course the Frankish cemetery. No comprehensive records exist about the graveyard of the Franks or even about the Great Fields of the Dead. The location and layout of both the graveyard and the larger necropolis can be pieced together from extant pictorial sources and literary references, as well as from the tombs transferred from Taksim to Feriköy. The best pictorial representation of the Great Fields of the Dead is an anonymous painting from the early 19th century that depicts the necropolis's Muslim, Armenian, and Frankish cemeteries. This group of cypresses shows the location of the Muslim cemetery running down the hill towards the Bosphorus. These tombs in the foreground are the south end of the Armenian cemetery. And the Frankish burial ground, the graveyard of the Franks, is here uh, between this military barracks, which was built around 1800, and this line of trees. Another image in an engraving from about the same period offers a more focused view of the graveyard of the Franks. The tombs illustrated are clearly European, as shown by the words Hik Yakut, which are visible on this stone in the foreground. And this image almost perfectly matches a contemporary literary description of the graveyard of the Franks, which was written by the Reverend Robert Wolfe, chaplain of the British Embassy at Constantinople, who visited this site in the 1830s. The Frank burying ground, he wrote, stands on a hill over the Bosphorus. It is open and denuded, without a tree or shrub to mark it. Yet here the dead of all the European nations repose together, and the tombstones mark the English, French, Dutch, German, etc., scattered through it. Reverend Walsh also described several specific monuments in the graveyard of the Franks, including the tomb of one Richard Hampton, an English merchant of Paris who died in 1689. This tomb is now situated in the Feriköy Protestant Cemetery's Monument Row. Close by, and also in the row, is a second grave marker mentioned by Wolfe, graved with a relief of cypress trees and a horse-drawn bier, out of which protrudes Death's arm holding a scythe. This sculpture so impressed Walsh that he included an illustration in his memoirs. The horses, he wrote, seem to confront the apparition and start off with terror, one looking behind and the other straining forward, as if to fly from the fearful image. The sculpture, though rude, is very spirited. It is without any kind of inscription, and no one from whom I inquired could tell me its age or designation. A monument that Walsh failed to mention, but which forms the focal point of the contemporary engraving, is a unique sarcophagus tomb. This anonymous monument, which lacks a lid, is also now located in the Feriköy Protestant Cemetery. In the 1840s, even as the unnamed artist was painting his landscape of the great fields of the dead, it was clear that the days of this huge necropolis were numbered. Much like today's city, 19th century Istanbul was undergoing rapid urban development. New construction especially impacted areas north of the Golden Horn, and cemeteries around Taksim were directly in the path of expansion. The first to close was the graveyard of the Franks. In 1853, the Ottoman authorities declared the graveyard unsuitable for burial since it was near populated areas and hindered development. To compensate, they offered land 2 miles away in Feriköy as a cemetery for both Protestants and Catholics. But the move was delayed by the Crimean War from 1854 to 56, and when the matter returned to the agenda in 1857, the land given in 1853 was judged too little for both communities, since the Catholics had already filled much of the space with military dead from the Crimea. The entire area was then turned over for the exclusive use of the Catholics. On the 29th of April, 1857, by order of Sultan Abdülhamid, adjacent separate site was available for Protestants. The land for the new cemetery was granted to the foreign legations that represented several Protestant powers. After negotiations, the diplomats drafted statutes that agreed to share the duty of administering the cemetery. This example of international unity was praised at the cemetery's opening in 1859. To secure this site, proclaimed the pastor of the Prussian legation, all members of the Protestant community joined in harmony. The worldly authorities set an example. This place is, as God wills, permanent memorial to the united Protestant princes and nations, and it is henceforth dedicated to his rule and purpose. Within 5 years of the new cemetery's establishment, circa 1864, tombs as well as human remains from the graveyard of the Franks were transferred to Feriköy. A large pedestal in the Protestant cemetery's Dutch National Section commemorates the move. Besides this monument, roughly 200 tombs and gravestones throughout the cemetery bear witness to the former Frankish burial ground at Taksim. Some mark grave sites, but most do not, including the largest concentration of 63 stones in Monument Row, which were brought to Feriköy and ranged along the cemetery's east wall under the direction of the British Embassy's chaplain. It was said that he rescued them from oblivion. Although they remain in place today, the stones of the row have certainly deteriorated from a century and a half of exposure to the elements and other dangers. Without greater protective measures, they still face oblivion. In 2018, to address this issue and other preservation matters, the Feriköy Protestant Cemetery Initiative was formed in the same spirit of international cooperation that marked the cemetery's founding. Created by academics affiliated with foreign research institutes linked to the nations whose diplomats manage the cemetery, the initiative aims to preserve the site as a burial ground as well as an historic landmark and nature sanctuary. In 2021, the cemetery's diplomatic governing board officially recognized the initiative as its partner in caring for the site. This was a landmark decision and the first time in the cemetery's history that a separate body had received such a mandate. The initiative's goals are challenging and their achievements require involvement with all tasks related to the site, most mundane daily operations to those that are more scholarly. After its establishment in 2018, the initiative began to record the cemetery. Despite suspension of field work during the pandemic, all the cemetery's tombs have been documented. Besides providing a record of these monuments, data from documentation has been used for managerial purposes, for instance, to evaluate potential burial space. The initiative has also publicized the cemetery and its heritage. In 2018, it launched a website, which has grown in 5 years. In 2020, it published a guidebook, the first in the cemetery's history. And in 2021, it began issuing a biannual bulletin, the Ledger, not only to report current happenings, but also to supplement the guidebook with new historical information as it comes to light. Among its publicity aims, the initiative has especially tried to raise interest in the audiences beyond Istanbul and Turkey. It first introduced the cemetery internationally in 2019 at the annual conference of the Association of Significant Cemeteries of Europe. And in 2022, the initiative helped the cemetery join ASCE, which has boosted its presence internationally. Because of the initiative's involvement, higher priority has been given to keep. In 2021, the entry gate was renovated. After that, attention was given to the chapel. The last comprehensive maintenance had been done about 25 years prior, and the building was suffering from leaks, drainage problems, as well as roof damage. In 2022, because of the initiative's efforts, the chapel was repaired with funds and by specialists from the Greater Istanbul municipality. Some of the initiative's least visible but most vital efforts have focused on improving administration, such as by introducing management software and creating standards to systemize operations. The initiative's most notable contribution in this regard has been the creation of a new set of general regulations. Rules have always existed for the cemetery. The earliest date to 1858, when they were drawn up at the meeting of the first governing board. These original regulations mainly list costs and conditions for burial permits and plot concessions. In the decades following, the prices were revised, but the content wasn't. Limited rules might have sufficed in the past, but they have failed to address many problems of the present. For instance, two major issues of concern have been the excessive sale of plots to single parties and the uncontrolled construction of monuments. To address these and other critical issues, the initiative produced comprehensive regulations in 2022, which the governing board ratified earlier this year. Henceforth, these regulations instituted by the initiative will ensure that the cemetery's space and heritage are protected from anything that might diminish them, including random plot sales and tomb constructions. The initiative's work of the last 5 years speaks for itself. Never in the cemetery's history has so much in so many different areas been done in so little time. There's more to do. And on that note, I'd like to conclude by thanking the Church Monument Society for hosting this lecture, which contributes to the initiative's efforts. I greatly appreciate having had the opportunity to present to a new international audience the history and heritage of the Feriköy Protestant Cemetery. And now turn it over to Daniel for the second part of the program.
Okay, thanks, Brian. That's a very important context, both to the site and to the work of the initiative. What I'll be describing now is one specific project of the initiative, which we carried out on the stones of Monument Row. That is, as mentioned, that row of older stones that were brought from Taksim to Feriköy in the 1860s. So this project was funded by the British Community Council of Istanbul, and as mentioned, it was to scan these 63 tombstones that compose Monument Row. So Brian has outlined some of the reasons that we thought this was necessary. These gravestones were deteriorating, and they also don't have any proper records. Whereas for the graves, the burials that were conducted in the 19th century and later, after the establishment of the site, we have details of the individuals and dates of birth and death and nationality. We don't have any such records for Monument Row, as those burials had been carried out at a much earlier date. The initiative has now digitized these burial registers, by the way, so people who are looking to kind of research the individuals buried in the cemetery can get in touch with the members of the initiative with any requests for research. And as mentioned, yeah, this image we see here, the transformation, the deterioration of the engraving of this horse-drawn burial cart that Brian mentioned earlier. In the space of 20 years, pollution and natural erosion has kind of caused the very dramatic deterioration of the stone. But what we're able to do with the scanning technique that we've used is kind of reverse time in a sense and bring out details that are otherwise invisible to the naked eye. So this image now in the center is the result of a scan that we made of this stone, and suddenly the hand of death and the scythe, the details of the carriage and trees behind it are all visible, which if I go back, you'll see are almost invisible today to the naked eye. And here's another example of an enhanced image of one of the stones. This one, you can actually see in the enhancement that it's been physically damaged, that a lot of the text has been erased by scraping from left to right at some point. So the technique that we used is called subject from motion reflectance transformation imaging, RTI in short, and it's a technique that's used mostly in archaeological sites in Turkey. And so we turned to an archaeologist, Aykan Akçay, who's a research assistant at Akdeniz University in Antalya, And he came in the summer 2 years ago to photograph the tombs. And he basically, it's a process in which you have to take thousands of photos or hundreds of photos of each individual tomb and then use a software to piece those together. The result is that we have these enhanced images, which if you move from the natural image on the left to the enhanced images on the right, you can see very clearly just how illuminating that technique is when you're dealing with engraving. And that allows us to read inscriptions, which were otherwise extremely difficult to decipher. Here's just one example, okay? Most of the inscriptions in the cemetery are in Latin, and so we also employed two translators, Matthew Tanton and Anika Asp, who are actually Byzantinists, but who were able to use their language skills to translate Latin into English. And from these photos, we were able also to create three-dimensional models. And that's especially useful for chest-shaped stones, which have, many surfaces that you can't see all of in a still image. And I'm going to show you now an example of one of those models. Okay, so here you can see, hopefully, one of these models, and you can rotate, and you can even look at it using, a virtual reality headset if you wish. And there are, on the Sketchfab website, which I can share a link with anyone who's interested, you can see all of the 63 stones that we scanned. Okay. We also then saved all of these images, as well as the data required to create these 3D models in the publicly accessible archive, so-called digital repository of the British Institute at Ankara. And there you can access information about each of these individual graves, as well as download, as I mentioned, the three-dimensional images, the enhanced images, and the transliterations and translations of the inscriptions. And I'll just quickly show you that. Yeah. Yeah, so here you should be able to see all of the different tombs that have been scanned in the site. When you open one of them, you'll get a series of different files which you can download or look at on the website. And here's one of the inscriptions transliterated and translated. In this case, there was rather damaged text and we weren't able to transliterate all of it, but in others, we were able to completely reproduce the text. Okay. Now, what we can learn from these is the life stories of the individuals who were buried in monument, at the graveyard of the Franks, and subsequently whose monuments were moved to Feriköy. And we get an idea of the kinds of people who were represented. By the way, most of these individuals, almost all of the individuals in Monument Row were either born in England or Scotland or Ireland. When they were originally buried, those were separate kingdoms, but obviously by the time that Feriköy opened, there was a united kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And most of the people, as you can see on this table, were merchants. People like Thomas Pigott, who traveled with many of his colleagues and who I was able to find a letter of protest about, which called for the release of English merchant ships that had been detained in a tax dispute during one of the Ottoman-Venetian wars. There were also doctors, people like William Parmentier, Edmund Frank, and George Baron Brown, who were commemorated in an early 20th century issue of The Lancet. Someone who we'll hear about more later, Thomas Baines, was also a doctor. There was consular staff like ambassadors such as Frederick Warner, who was the brother of the collector of manuscripts, the famed collector of Oriental manuscripts, which are deposited in Leiden University. and their secretaries like George Philip Albert, who served William Paget, the ambassador of Britain to Istanbul in 1693 to 1702. Moving into the early 19th century graves, you see engineers, people who had come to the Ottoman Empire to work on the expansion of its railways and ports as it was increasingly integrated into the world economy. And you also see a large number of family members, wives and children, such as an example here of, here are the graves I've just been talking about, sorry, including, for example, the two daughters of the ambassador, Peter Witch, who served from 1627 to 1641. He left a message in English at the end, under the Latin inscription, farewell, dear babes, for I must leave you here. His children had died, and that's a very common cause of death. In fact, child mortality is very evident in the graves that we have in Monument Row. We also see other causes of death. For example, in the 17th and 18th century tombstones, we see a lot of cases of plague, such as the one displayed on your screen. You can see, I think it says somewhere pestium or cum morte. Yeah, morbo pestilentiali. Sorry, I'm not, I don't know Latin, but that's definitely death from plague. And then moving into the 19th century, we see people dying from cholera, which spread in that period to Istanbul, and typhus. We also see the graves of several women who died in childbirth, and as mentioned earlier, the graves of children. We also start to see connections between the graves of different individuals. So, for example, we have here two graves of Vanessa Thomas Coke and George Bridges. Now, in the text of Vanessa Thomas Coke's a great tombstone, we learn that she was the first, so that George Bridges was her first husband. He had died some years previous to her, and that she decided to remarry and married another English merchant living in Istanbul at the time. And then you can use that information to then try and find, contextual information about the pair. So looking up George Bridges, I found his will and testament in the National Archives in Britain. And interestingly, he conditioned some of his will on what his surviving wife would do. So he gave her the house that he had in Istanbul, but only offered the share of his properties in England if she returned to England. But the fact that she's buried in Istanbul tells us she chose not to do that. And as mentioned, she decided to remarry and remain in Istanbul until the end of her life. We also see large families. So, for example, the Abbot family, who moved to the Ottoman Empire in the early 18th century and established this sort of dynasty that survived for over a century and spread across the major merchant ports of the empire to places like Thessaloniki and Aleppo, as well as some of their descendants of Jasper Abbot, pictured here whose grave is pictured here on the right, remaining in Istanbul. So we have the grave both of Jasper Abbot and his grandson, George Abbot. And there's an Abbot family tree that was compiled by Nikiforos Sivenas, who's had a piece of research focused on the abbots of Thessaloniki. And you also see connections with ancestors back in England. So, for example, we have in this grave, we see that the coat of arms of Maurice Tresham, and using that coat of arms, I was able to confirm the connection with the Treshams of Northampton, who had a family manor house that was then destroyed and built over in the 19th century. And in an ongoing connection between this property and Istanbul, it was later inhabited by William Harbord, who had died in Belgrade on his way to take up his appointment as the ambassador at Constantinople in 1691. So one case study I wanted to delve into in a bit more detail, just because it's so fascinating, but also because it's a topic that has been dealt with before in the Journal of the Church Monument Society, in an article in 1995, some of you may remember it, by Jean Wilson. She looked in this article at several monuments to what we can call homoromantic relationships. And one of the memorial stones at the cemetery is dedicated to Thomas Baines, who is the figure on the left, by his lifelong partner, the ambassador, John Finch. And this stone is really a testimony to the very intense and deep relationship between these two men. So Finch and Baines, they met as students at Cambridge, where Baines, who was a country squire, had acted as a sizar, which was a kind of scholarship where you provided services to a richer student. And in this case, he served John Finch, who was a nobleman. And then they later moved together to Padua in Italy, where they studied medicine. And then Finch was appointed ambassador to Tuscany and finally ambassador to Constantinople in 1674. Finch would play an important role securing renewed capitulations, that is, renewed legal privileges for English subjects in the Ottoman Empire during his ambassadorship. And for most of their time in Istanbul, for most of their time in the Ottoman Empire, they actually resided not in Istanbul, but in Edirne, Adrianople, because that was the site of the court of the Sultan at the time, who was in the European capital of the Ottomans, because he was conducting military campaigns in Europe. This was the time of the siege of Vienna. There was a plague that broke out in Adrianople and later in Istanbul, but it wasn't the plague that would finish off Baines, but rather kidney stones that caused a fever, according to this monument. And the reason this monument is so remarkable is because it has such a long inscription. It covers both sides of this chest-shaped tomb, and it just tells you just how affected Finch was by the death of his partner. He describes his friend's death as having, quote, cut off the thread of all my worldly happiness and application to business, end quote. Finch had Baines's body embalmed so that it could be transported back to England, but his organs, which were perishable, were buried in Pera, possibly near to the later site of the cemetery, as they were residing outside of the main city at what was called at the time St. Demetrius Hill, in order to lessen their risk of catching plague. And so this monument was erected just to mark the site of the burial of Baines's organs. And the dedication written by Finch celebrates what he calls, to quote, the marriage of souls between the pair. And there's almost 350 words of Latin on both sides of the monument, and I'm going to show you now a translation. This translation was provided by Edwin Pears, who was a British journalist resident in early 20th century Istanbul. And it's recorded in a book by Archibald Murray from 1917, in which he studied the life of Finch and Baines. Now, it's very valuable because some of the sections of the present day inscription were indecipherable. And apparently, according to Murray, Pearce actually transcribed all of the inscriptions in Monument Row. And the fact that this was done over 100 years ago would make it an extremely valuable document for the cemetery, but we haven't yet been able to locate this transcription, except in this one case where it was recorded in a publication. So I'll give you some time to read, or in fact, I will read, just in case some of you can't quite see this clearly, the inscription. Oops. So, this is erected to the wonderful pious friendship to be venerated in every age between the most renowned and illustrious man, Sir Thomas Baines, Knight, whose bowels are deposited here, and the most honourable and excellent Sir John Finch, Knight, Ambassador, etc., who after a beautiful and unbroken marriage of souls and a companionship undivided during 36 complete years, with groanings commits, and at the same time envies these parts, sacred to an unspeakable love, and these remains very dear to him, to the Byzantine dominion. Whatever fervor of the body by preparation could be embalmed, all this the ambassador brings with him, coming home into England, a dear but sad companionship, so that the inseparable friends may be enclosed in the same tomb. For it does not appear right that their dead ashes should be distinguished, who, whilst they were living, put far away from them the words mine and thine, as hateful and hostile to friendship. And hence friendship, which to other mortals is a bare name, between us without doubt became a great thing, and a true virtue, in times gone by perhaps unheard of in history, and in the future scarcely to be imitated. This ornament and honour to friendship, always thou shalt wonder at, O traveller, but now thou shalt weep, if thou hast a heart, who like his who bears, or like his who places this marble. And that's side A. Side B. Now let me say a few things out of many concerning my most honourable and beloved friend Baines. In all things literary, he was so profoundly learned that thou wouldst have believed the shades of Plato and the Stagirite to have lived in him, were it not that he easily surpassed each of them in the sublimity of his knowledge, and all other men in the celebrity of his name. For to him alone, as I know, were known the movements of universal reason. Nor was he less great in what he did, on which account the most serene Ferdinand II and Cosimo III, princes of immortal wisdom, numbered our Baines amongst the most famous men, and spread forth his name by conversations, letters, and above all by their gifts, as in the manner of these heroes towards remarkable men, and the prince, the father, used to call him the Ironhead. For indeed in his jests, for he was a man of charming wit, he put forth nothing that was not at the same time directed to some serious object. Thereupon, by this unimpaired virtue and by the gravity of his manners, he was revealed so that no one dared to wound his ears with speeches less becoming. Cruel tortures arising from the laceration of the stones of the bladder, two were the size of a walnut, he bore with Christian fortitude, beyond the boasting of the stoicism. Alas, what a grief! I have suffered the irreparable loss of such a man and of such a friendship, whilst between embracing and groaning, I have listened to his last breath on the 5th day of September 3rd, hour PM, 1681, in the 59th year of his age. I shall live, O beloved, mindful of our friendship, and no day shall ever remove us from a remembering age. Now, on his return to England, Finch also fell ill and set out his will and testimony, and he requested to be buried together with the embalmed body of Baines at Christ College Chapel in Cambridge, and endowed a number of scholarships in both their names. After Finch's death, on the 18th of November 1682, a monument was built to the two men in Christ College Chapel, and that's what the article in the Church Monument Society's journal especially focuses on. That has a second inscription, which notes that Finch had, to quote, taken care of the viscera of his friend, burying them in the Byzantine earth, adding an elegant marble where he thanked for their battle together, referring to the monument now in Feriköy. This dedication to the pair was written by the master of Christ College Chapel, who had been a traveling who had been a clergyman who had traveled in the Ottoman Empire. And there's also a monument in the chapel to the clergyman John Covell, who had also met them in a dinner during his travels in Asia Minor. So that concludes really the story of Finch and Baines in brief. And I just wanted to say that there is a lot more work that can be done, and many more similar stories, if perhaps not such romantic ones, that we can discover in the cemetery. And an obvious next step would be to carry out the same process of scanning on another 40 stones that lie along the southern wall of the cemetery, which also are composed of stones brought from the earlier burial ground of the Franks. Both of these walls are problematic for the conservation of the stones because, well, this one in particular is adjacent to an apartment building where detritus has fallen onto the graves. The other one is rather low and has been used to access the cemetery without permission. And so there's a risk of further damage and vandalism to these rather beautiful ancient stones. So I think that, you know, if we continue this process, and if others continue to investigate these stones, we're going to learn a lot more about life in, you know, 17th and 18th and early 19th century Istanbul, and of these individuals and their biographies. I'll leave it there. Thank you.